Hello and happy Thursday. My name is Megan Hernandez and I work with our Family Development Program here at MAHUBE-OTWA. Today we are live at MAHUBE-OTWA to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month by hosting a conversation with a couple individuals who are rooted in their culture. Before we introduce our guests, let me cover a few facts about Hispanic Heritage Month, MAHUBE-OTWA, and a few demographics from our surrounding communities. Hispanic Heritage Month runs from September 15th to October 15th each year, and it traditionally honors the cultures and contributions of both Hispanics and Latinx Americans, while also celebrating the heritage we bring that is rooted in all Latin American countries. MAHUBE-OTWA has 5 main administrative offices that are located in Mahnomen, Hubbard, Becker, Ottertail, and Wadena counties. Yet we also provide additional services to an additional 15 counties. There is a map on our website if you are curious about the specifics. Some demographic information from the surrounding communities about the Hispanic population are as follows. According to the U.S. Census Bureau from 2020, the percentage of Hispanic Americans in the following counties are, and here I go with them. Becker County has 2.9% Hispanic Americans. Ottertail County, 3.9%. Hubbard County, 2.9%, followed by Mahnomen County at 5%. And lastly, but not least, Wadena County, 2.4%. In the United States, Hispanic individuals make up about 19% of the total population. Now let me introduce our guests. Today we have with us Marta Castaño, along with Dr. Creel Falcon. Marta, if you don't mind, could you get us started by introducing yourself? And could you also include and talk a little bit about the work you do and how you identify?
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Buenas tardes para todos los que están ahí que hablan español. Mi nombre es Marta Castañón. My name is Marta Castañón. Excuse me, Marta Castañón. I also go by Marta. And I consider myself a Minnesota norteña, Minnesota homegrown, because my parents met and married up here in a little town called Comstock, Minnesota. They were farm workers. And so all of us kids, I am the oldest, we were all born here. And in fact, in the building across the street that used to be St. Ansgar Hospital. So my parents worked as farm workers. So every year we worked in the sugar beet fields. There were several summers that we went to Wisconsin to pick cucumbers. And as a child growing up, there were several years that we would go down to Texas, to Crystal City, Texas, and we'd be there for the winter. And often travel into Mexico to see my mom's family and my dad's family. So I got a taste of what it was like to attend school in Texas and attend school in Minnesota. And it was vastly different, but I loved school down in Texas. And the reason for that, even though the schools were poor, the equipment wasn't that great, the buildings were not that great, but I felt like I fit in. As a Mexican American, going to school here in Minnesota as a child, in the 60s and 70s, our family and another family were the only Mexican American families in that little town. And in Texas, everyone was pretty much brown like me, spoke Spanish like me. Most of the families and my friends, they were all farm workers. So many of my friends that I met down in Texas, they would come up here to work in the summertime in the sugar beet fields back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So I felt like I fit in. Eventually, in 1974, my dad got sick and we never went back to Texas. And all of us kids ended up graduating from Moorhead High School. And it was something that my parents were very, very proud of, because my mother knew how much I hated school here, and I wanted to drop out, but she said, no, you got to go, you got to finish. So it was something that my parents were very proud of, that all of their 6 kids graduated in a very white high school, where most of the kids, I think there were only myself and 2 other kids in my class that were Mexican American or Hispanic or Latinos or whatever you want to call them. I worked for many years with migrant legal services, and we would work with the farm workers with the issues they had with housing, labor disputes, contract disputes, sometimes issues with social services that didn't want to provide them services. So I worked there for many, many years. And then right now I work with the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, a Department of Justice accredited representative, which means that I'm not an attorney, but I can sign off on certain types of immigration forms. So I have helped a lot of people file for citizenship, renew their green cards. I do a lot of refugee adjustment, and I really like what I do. I'm very happy with the work that I'm doing. Right now, I'm the chairperson for the Minnesota Latino Affairs Council. And I also serve on the Center for Rural Development and Policy. As the years have gone by, I believe in and not everyone agrees with me, but in order to help the whole population, you have to give a little bit of yourself. And serving on these committees, I have learned a lot about what goes on behind the scenes in planning policy and passing a bill. So I really believe that people need to become more involved with their local communities in order to see some change in their communities.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing. Dr. Falcone, do you mind going next?
Happily, wonderful to be with you all this afternoon. Happy Latinx History Month to all who celebrate. My name is Candace Creel Falcone. I go by they, them pronouns, and I currently live in Otter Tail County. So I came to Minnesota in 2004 to pursue my doctoral degree in feminist studies at the University of Minnesota. And have been in various parts of the state ever since. I am rounding the bend towards having spent more time in Minnesota than any other place that I've lived. And I also married somebody who grew up in Minnesota. So I feel like I am ready to become a true Minnesotan. I originally grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but I was born in Kansas as a 3rd-generation Mexican American, born in the state of Kansas. So Midwestern geographies are super important to me. And I actually spent a lot of time researching and collecting stories of folks who also grew up in Midwestern places for my dissertation work, which is how I met the lovely Marta Castañon, who's joining us today. And I could listen to her tell her stories all day long. And I'm so glad that she's here as a part of this panel. I went into academia and spent almost 10 years at MSUM in Moorhead, teaching women's and gender studies and directing the program there. And then in 2019, I left my tenured position to pursue a creative life as a full-time visual artist and writer. And so I spend my time painting stories and connecting storytelling to the ways that we are connected to our communities. And so a recent project that I completed in Otter Tail County was gathering narratives from people who are connected to our foodways in the county as part of a grant-funded project. And doing that work helped me connect with people who run the mercados or some of the restaurants, the Mexican owned and run restaurants across the county in places like Fergus Falls and Pelican Rapids. And it's been a real delight getting to know this community a little bit more since I moved here in 2017. I live in rural Earhart currently.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Next, we have a series of 5 questions that we're going to run through. A couple of them are open for the both of you, and there's a couple that we've identified who we'd like to answer the question. So to get us started, Marcia and Candace, this one is open to the both of you. But just kind of wondering, like, what does Hispanic Heritage Month mean to you? Kind of a big question, so whoever is comfortable with going first, the floor is yours. Oh, Martha, I think you're still muted, so you'll just have to hit that button.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
So I guess for me it means, I mean, we as Hispanics or Latinos or whatever we call ourselves, we celebrate our heritage every day. So, but I think what it means is for the other communities out there, schools, businesses, to really recognize the contributions that our community has participated in, the contributions that we have made, that kind of thing, and recognizing the fact that some of the foods that and other things that the general population enjoys comes from the Latino community. I always kind of get a kick out of what they call the rodeos, you know, the cowboys and all that stuff. When that started with the Mexican heritage and the Spanish that came over into Mexico, and they brought those skills with them, and that's how the rodeo developed. And it's interesting to see the differences between a Mexican rodeo and one here in the United States. But I think it's recognizing that the businesses, government recognize the contributions that our culture has contributed to the United States and to the American way of life.
Absolutely. I will just add to that. The United States, if we think about the historical origins of this nation, the story that's often told is one that starts in 1776 with the arrival and, you know, nation building that's rooted in our English colonization past. But Hispanic Heritage Month or Latinx Heritage Month, Latina Heritage Month really is an opportunity for us to delve deeper into broader understandings of our history as a nation, and recognizing that there are other beginning points to this nation's identity that precede that, which is exactly what Martha's talking about here. There's an amazing episode of Latino USA that Maria Hinojosa hosts that I would encourage everybody to listen to, and maybe we can add a link to it in the comments after this goes live. That really does that work of tracing like US history back to Spanish colonization as an entry point to better understanding the influence of Latino culture in the US in a more broad way. And, one of the oldest cities in the United States is Santa Fe, New Mexico. And when we center that space as an origin point of the story of the United States, you have to take into consideration more the impact and contribution that Latinos have had in this nation. And I'd also add that a lot of times the Latino community is really invisibilized, especially in Midwestern geographies. And by that, I mean, others don't recognize our presence. And so I hear a lot of times in the circles I'm in that, rural Minnesota is so white, for instance. And while that is true that there's a high population of white folks that live in rural communities, the percentages of Latinos living in rural places is actually quite high. So even though those numbers seem really small that you had mentioned earlier, Megan, like for Ottertail County, 3.9% of the population is understood to be Hispanic or Latino. Like that's actually a pretty high percentage in the context of the numbers of people that are living in rural areas. So I spend a lot of my time educating folks about our presence in rural communities, and especially in Minnesota. And Latinos tend to be one of the highest percentages of people of color. So if you're looking at like BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, to choose to live in rural communities. And so it's also important for us to spend some time thinking about how can we uplift and celebrate, honor, and welcome those who have been in our communities and continue to shape the beautifulness of our rural communities in the state.
Great, thank you. So our second question, we're going to talk a little bit more about words. So Dr. Falcone, I was wondering if you could take this question. It's kind of got two parts. So the first part is Hispanic versus Latinx. Do they mean the same or do they have a different meaning?
Yeah, so a great question. And Martha kind of already alluded to this, like however we call ourselves. Hispanic is a term that was created by the US government in the 1970s to describe a group of people that largely originate from Spanish heritage. And so Hispanic really connects to that particular colonization thread. And during the 1960s to 80s, Mexican folks who have deeper connections with their indigenous roots, or perhaps also wanted to articulate their own sense of identity, chose other words to describe themselves that the United States government wasn't putting on forms to let them pick for the census, for example. So words like Chicano for the Chicano civil rights movement, Chicano rights farm worker movement, all kinds of ways people chose to describe themselves rooted in particular phrases. I guess in the 90s, there was a shift to try to expand that notion beyond Hispanic into Latino as a framework. And that was to try to acknowledge that there are people from Latin America who don't speak Spanish as their first language, or don't have that Spanish language as deeply influenced into their culture. So folks from Brazil, for instance, is a good example, can be called Latino, but aren't necessarily identified as Hispanic through a language umbrella as a way to describe people. So when you ask about Latinx, that has been a more recent intervention that attempts to destabilize the gendered nature of Spanish. So this is all history. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot here, but around the same time, 1980s to now, feminists have been challenging this idea that like Latino means all of us. So in Spanish, there's O's and A's that are associated with men and women. It's a gendered language. And so kind of like mankind is a word that we use to describe all humans, but man is in that descriptor. So it's kind of really privileging one gender over another, even though culturally we kind of accept it as describing everybody. So a similar thing is with the word Latino. it means all Latinos, regardless of gender, but it really privileges that masculine word. And so we had the Latino / Latina as like a feminist intervention that probably was something that came about in the early 90s to really challenge that and like really call out that women exist and should be honored and, you know, count as well. And Latinx is a new iteration of really trying to challenge that gender binary by creating opportunities for people who might be outside of the gender binary or who are gender queer, gender fluid, to see themselves really related and reflected in our language choices. And you might also see Latine as an option with an E at the end as a gender neutral. So it's just the way that languages adapt and change over time. But it is probably important to check in with the groups and the people that you're talking to see what kind of term they like to use to describe themselves. Some people don't like to call themselves Latino or Hispanic. They want to be called from their national origin, Mexican American or Chicano or Honduran or Salvadoreña. So it really is an opportunity to get to know your neighbors more and your friends and ask them what they prefer, because there are conventions that are kind of applied to our groups. And then there's ways that we try to navigate through those ourselves to reclaim some of our agency and how we connect to our identity categories.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I'm learning so much myself as well. So I feel like you sort of touched base on this, but maybe just to circle back a little bit. Latinx versus BIPOC, are they the same or are they different?
Yeah, great. So Latino is an ethnic categorization. So the way that the United States has decided to approach categorizing people in like the census is through racial designations. And so Latinx is an umbrella term, but folks under that umbrella could be any race. So often on forms from the government, you'll see like check Hispanic or check Latino, Latinx, and then it will say, what is your racial identity? So and that's where it will go into Black or Indigenous or white or Asian as some subcategories underneath that Latino umbrella, because Latino is an ethnic designation, not a racial one. And so it's easy to kind of see how that might be confused with other words like BIPOC, which is an acronym that stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So most Latinx folks will probably identify as BIPOC in some way, but not all. So BIPOC is an umbrella term to try to capture some solidarity between groups who have been marginalized by race. And so if you are an Afro-Latino, for instance, you would definitely fit under that BIPOC umbrella, right? But and because it's an ethnic identity, things get really tricky. So there can be very like white appearing Latinos who still experience the racialization of anti-Latino sentiment in the United States, and feel and carry that, but might not experience it to the same extent as somebody who has a darker skin tone. So very complicated, complex, unnecessarily so, but this is the world in which we live in terms of how we as a culture have approached race. And of course, racism as a result of making race, because we create these social hierarchies where people have more or less access to resources based on how they fall within these different categories.
Thank you. Marta, our next question is going to be geared towards you. So if you don't mind, our next question has to do with the history of immigration. Can you share with us what you know on what the history of immigration about as it relates to the Hispanic community? I think you touched base earlier as you were introducing yourself, but if you don't mind sharing a little bit more, that would be great.
Oh, gosh, I should have done my homework. Well, I mean, immigration has been going on since the time that the US, ever since Columbus supposedly discovered America. So there's been people coming into the United States for hundreds of years, and there's been waves of immigration, and there's been all these different changes in immigration law. And I remember at one time, I think it was in the 1800s, they had the Chinese Exclusion Act, where people of Chinese descent could not become US citizens, even when they were born here. So there's been a lot of changes. There's been different waves of immigration, and there's also been something called the refugee status. So there would be refugees that would come in from different countries because of the wars in their country. So when World War I and World War II was happening in Europe there, and after that, there were waves of refugees that came in from certain countries, from the European countries. So when it happened in Vietnam, we had some of those refugees coming into the United States. So there's been different waves throughout the time. And it seems like people, you know, when you're talking in the earlier centuries, they seem to be a lot of people from Eastern Europe, Russia, who would come in. And then in the 1900s, you had a lot of Mexicans coming in who were either leaving Mexico because of some disaster. I seem to remember hearing my grandmother talk about a flood that devastated the crops. Also, the Mexican Revolution happened, and there were a lot of people coming in. And somehow they were able to get their status because it was easier back then. In 1980, the mid 1980s, there was an Immigration Reform and Control Act, or we called it IRCA. Thousands and thousands of people who had been here with no legal documentation were able to were able to apply for their status. And most of them received a temporary status. And after that temporary status, they could file to get their green card. It was a wonderful opportunity for people to legalize their status. And now many of them have become US citizens. So throughout the years, there's been these different programs in the immigration system to allow people to come in. And now we've got the situation going on at the border. I don't want to touch too much of that because I don't work with that. But right now there's many who are being, people who have been here undocumented, who are being granted temporary protected status, which is called TPS. It doesn't really give them legal status, but it does allow them to have employment authorization and be able to work, to be able to continue to stay here. And sometimes it gets renewed. It all depends on the situation that's going on in their home country. And I'm really sorry about that bell. We have a bell that rings in the front, so it can be very annoying. Let me shut that off. I'm so sorry about that. I'm so sorry. So throughout the years, there's been different immigration programs that have allowed people to stay and be able to work. And I'm seeing a lot of my clients, they're becoming US citizens. That's their goal, is to become US citizens. The ones with temporary protective status, they oftentimes have to renew their employment authorizations, and that all depends on if temporary protected status was renewed. So with immigration, there's a lot of ifs, ands, or buts. I get a lot of calls for people who want to petition for a family member, and unfortunately, I don't do those anymore. And it's a process that's complicated. It all depends on whether that person has a prior history with immigration, and if they do, it's complicated. So yeah, it's hard to talk. It's really hard to give you exact information on the history of immigration, because it has changed and evolved throughout the years. So
Sure. Well, that's all right. Thank you very much, though, for what you did respond with. That was great. So we have 2 questions left. We're getting down there, so thank you. Fourth question, and it's open for the both of you. What can people do to support the Hispanic community? To help lift us up and celebrate us and the contributions that we bring. Like, any ideas on any first steps in that direction?
well, I think for me is supporting the businesses, and us as whatever we want to call ourselves, can also support those businesses. Also recognizing the fact that for me, it's inappropriate to ask, where were you born? And I don't know how to take it. I remember as a kid growing up constantly being asked, are you from Mexico? And I go, no, I was born here in Moorhead. So kind of recognizing the fact that not everyone was born in a foreign country just because they've got Hispanic or Spanish surname. It doesn't mean that they were born in a different country. I think taking the effort to know more about their culture and their community, but not making assumptions that they celebrate whatever holidays, because not everyone does. So I think it's really making the effort to get to know that person and realizing that each person is an individual, and we shouldn't be lumped all together as being the same.
That's so important. I'll just add to that. While Mexican Americans are the largest percentage of Latinx folks in the United States, that umbrella term really describes or, encompasses a lot of different cultures. And so getting to that learning piece is so critical. Enjoy and support the businesses that are available in your community. Watch and support media that includes representations of Latinx people. The first ever Latinx superhero headed movie, The Blue Beetle, just came out this summer, and it was so fantastic to see a Latino community, like a Latino family, positively portrayed in this like big blockbuster movie, and just getting to see stories that resonate with your own experience can be so powerful for those of us who are still figuring out our identity and our connection to our culture. And it's exciting and important for folks who are outside of the culture to be able to gain some insights through that. There's wonderful podcast recommendations of listening to Latino stories, like gaining better understanding about the history of Latinos in this country. And I guess I would also just say, again, that piece around folks making assumptions about communities. I think it's so important for all of us to do our part in recognizing that we have Latino neighbors wherever we live in the state, even if it is in a rural community, and probably especially if it is in a rural community. And one of the things that I just am really excited, Martha had mentioned that she's chairing MCLA's board right now, which I'm so excited about. I was once on the MCLA board for congressional district back in the day. is the legislative win that we had at the last session for folks who are undocumented to be able to apply for a driver's license in the state. And so that is an effort that had been underway for years, spearheaded by Latino activists and organizers in the state. And the fact that it finally got passed at the legislature is such a big victory because it helps bring our community from out of the shadows and allows them a little bit of access to feeling a bit more comfort in community, that if they're driving, they're not gonna possibly be sent back to a country that they have fled for a variety of reasons. So it's so important to celebrate those victories and advocate on behalf of our Latino neighbors in future opportunities like that.
It took 20 years to get it passed.
20 years.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Last but not least, and I know we talked about, or it was mentioned a little bit about, what it might be like for someone that is Hispanic, going to school, attending these rural West Central Minnesota schools, and I am one of them. And I feel like for me, or I don't feel like, I know for me, growing up as a child, like I was just often confused about my identity, what it meant. And sometimes some of the questions I would even get from community members, like just not understanding what they were asking or why I was different or why they're asking me that. And I feel like I'm still, taking strides to heal from different aspects of like what it did to me growing up with just being confused identity wise. So I want to ask the both of you, like, what are you most hopeful for? And in particular for our future generations as we move forward into the coming years.
Well, I think for me, what I want to see more participation on here in my community, I also am an election judge. So when there's elections going on, at the tables, helping people register, or making sure that they're already registered. And what I would like to see is more of the Hispanic, Latino community coming and voting, the ones that can. And I often hear the phrase, pues para qué, what for? My vote doesn't count. And I go, it does, because what's going to happen is that our senators and representatives, they're going to be looking at those numbers, at the demographics, and they're going to see a larger Latino community voting, and they're going to start saying, I need to start reaching out to those communities, because I think most of our representatives and senators aren't aware of how many of us there are in the community, and we need to make our voices heard through the means of voting. I think the schools have come a long way since when I was a kid, because I went to school in Sabin, Minnesota, and when I started school, I only knew 3 words of English: hi, bye, and okay. That's all I knew. So I've come a long way since then, and I think the schools are doing much better. So my hope is that I want to see more voting, and I want to see more of our community participating with their local governments, whether it's running for city office or county office, or just sitting on a committee like the Park and Boards Committee or the Human Rights Committee. We need to make our voices heard through those means.
So important. Yes, civic engagement is just the way that we need to continue to engage in our communities. I guess what's giving me hope is 2 parts. One is, when you look at the changing demographics of the United States as a whole, and then also in our smaller rural communities, most of the population growth is happening in the Latino community because of family sizes, because of cultural traditions, because of a lot of different factors. But to me, I have so much hope in like the changing demographics as they will continue to unfold, that become the driver for places like institutional change to happen in schools or in our civic engagement, in our governmental services. You know, even having this conversation being hosted by MAHUBE-OTWA today, right, is evidence that there is a community that we are trying to uplift and connect to, and that there are shifts that are happening that we need to adjust for as we continue to move on. So that really gives me hope, and I love seeing happy, beautiful brown children in our rural communities, like just thriving. Like that brings me a lot of joy and a lot of hope. And then the second part is related to how our state is really trying to address and or come to better understanding around the Latino community. So I serve on the board of the Blandon Foundation, which is located in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, but they serve rural Minnesota communities as well as Grand Rapids and the surrounding area in Itasca County. And so much of our work in its current direction is about creating thriving rural communities, and communities that are thriving are taking advantage of the gifts and benefits that diversity brings within a community. And so folks want to be able to eat delicious food in their rural towns, right? They want to be able to buy homemade goods. They want to be able to collect art from people who are making work that is connected and rooted in their culture, as just some ways to connect and be supportive. So I have a lot of hope as we continue on our trajectory as a state. You know, a small example is I know the artist Louis Fitch, who was appointed to this new commission to redesign the state flag to be more inclusive and welcoming for all of the cultures that are part of our Minnesota landscape. And so to me, these are just signs that we are kind of turning a corner and becoming much more, you know, welcoming, positive, inclusive communities. It's hard work. I'm not like being Pollyannish about this. Like, it's not always easy. It's not always fun. But the fact is that there are folks who are doing that work, and that really is hopeful to me and inspires me.
Well, thank you to both of you so much for your time today, for creating this space and sharing your knowledge and your resources and just everything you brought with you today. I feel like I don't have any other follow-up questions. I don't believe we have any questions from the audience, so I think we can wrap it up, and I hope the both of you have a fabulous rest of your day and a fabulous rest of Hispanic Heritage Month as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. It was a pleasure to see you all. It was a pleasure to do this and to educate. So thank you.
Thank you. Same.
Thank you.